The first vicious cycle is that we just get stuck in one point of view. And we talk about it as intensification because we get stuck, we continue to do the things that we've always done, we intensify what we've always done, and then when the world changes around us, we're stuck and we're like, we can't get out of it. And so we talk about that as like falling down a rabbit hole. And so that might be, the fact that some people might get stuck in the job that they're currently in because they're not willing to learn something new simultaneously. They're performing really well. They don't want to pause. They don't want to stop what they're doing. And yet what we know is that performance is eventually going to be no longer valuable to the company.
Everyone's talking about the metaverse these days, but Workplace from Meta is different. I mean, the clue's in the name, right? Workplace is a business communication tool that uses features like instant messaging and video calls to help people share information. Think Facebook, but for your company. It's part of Meta's vision for the future of work, a future in which your job isn't just something you do, but something you experience. And if you've been listening to this show, you know that experience is something that I am very passionate about and talk about a lot. Workplace from Meta is creating a future in which we'll all feel more present, connected, and productive. You can learn more and start your journey into the future of work at workplace.com/future. Again, that's workplace.com/future. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leading the Future of Work. My guest today is Wendy Smith. She is a professor at the University of Delaware. She is also the co-founder and co-director of the Learner Women's Leadership Initiative and author of what I think is a pretty cool new book called Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. Wendy, thank you for joining me.
Jacob, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, with lots of fun stuff to talk about. Why don't we start very high level with why you felt the need to write this book?
I love it. Well, so my co-author, Marianne Lewis, and I wrote this book because we've been studying the idea of paradox and both-anding for 25 years because we've seen this language increasingly used in the media, used in politics, used in consulting, used in leadership, and because we wanted to help people go beyond the labels of both and to think about, well, what does this really mean?
Yeah.
So that's why we wrote the book.
And so so when you talk about paradoxes, I guess, what do you mean when you say paradoxes?
Such a good question. Some people, when they hear the word paradox, are all in. Tell me more. Some people run away. So it's kind of a big word, and I love starting by unpacking it. One way you can unpack the word paradox is this classic paradox, the liar's paradox. And so this is a classic philosophical paradox, and it boils down to the idea, I am lying. And so this comes from Greek philosophy thousands of years ago. And the idea is, if I'm lying and I say I'm lying, I'm telling the truth. And if I'm telling the truth and I say I'm lying. So you are stuck in this cyclical cycle between truth and lying, and you can't really get out of it. Okay, so that is enough to get your mind.
Yeah, I'm still trying to think. I remember I heard once like a similar version of like you're walking down a path and there's a fork in the road. Or I'm going to totally butcher this, but it's like, that the person on the left tells the truth and the person on the right is a liar or something like that. And you can, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but it's one of those like weird mind games.
Totally. Well, here's another one. If we want to just play mind games for a minute, there's the paradox of Theseus's ship. So if Theseus
I know that one.
replaces every single part of their ship, every plank, and has a different ship, is the ship the same ship or a different ship? Right? That's like enough to get your mind kind of going. So we can play those mind games, and I do that with my kids for sure. We take this idea and think about, well, how does it affect our lives? And what we argue is that what we experience, what we find is, we all experience a lot of dilemmas, trade-offs, competing demands in our lives. And it could be anything from do I focus on my current career, or do I learn something new and do something new for tomorrow? It could be leaders thinking about, do I manage for today or tomorrow? Do I manage people or sorry, do I manage for my bottom line and my profits, or do I think about people and the planet? All these competing ideas. And what we argue is that these kinds of paradoxes underlie those competing ideas, and we can unpack this for sure. But these interdependent contradictions underlie these competing ideas. And if we can kind of look beyond the competing ideas and see the paradoxes, we can make better decisions. Or I'll just say something a little more simple because this might be a better way to get into it. We tend to think about decisions as an either or, and oftentimes it's a both and both anding lets us do better, lets us make better decisions.
Okay. Well, just hearing you talk, I mean, one paradox, at least for leaders, that popped into my mind is like, we ask leaders to be authentic and transparent, but oftentimes when leaders take a stance on certain issues that we don't agree with, we then come after them with pitchforks. So
Absolutely.
as a leader, you're probably like, well, I want to be authentic and I want to take a stance, but I know if I take a stance, people might get upset with me for disagreeing. So do I take the stance, or, do I just keep it to myself and not be authentic? And I know that a lot of leaders struggle with that.
It's such a good one, and the invitation here, the invitation of so this is a book about a big idea, and it's a big idea that can apply across to our individual selves and to our leaders. The invitation here is to say, okay, well, do I take a stand and be authentic, or do I sort of lead in a more global way that I'm not offending people, right? The invitation in both and thinking is to say, okay, well, how do I both take a stand and be authentic and at the same time not offend people? How do I do both of those at the same time? That's what we're trying to explore.
Okay. So let's start with our traditional thinking. So the either or is kind of what you argue is like the outdated way. We should move away from that. And the either or is kind of like you pick one or the other, right? Do I be authentic and offend people, or am I not authentic and I don't take a stance? And you basically can only pick one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the both and, which is interesting. I mean, obviously, of course, everybody would love to be able to do both and, not offend everybody and do all that sort of stuff. Easier said than done. But I suppose before we start talking about some of the solutions, one of the things that you talk about earlier on in your book are these tensions. Yeah. And it seems like the tensions, would you say they're the causes of these paradoxes that we're stuck with?
Well, I think what we would argue is these paradoxes exist in the world, so we're stuck with them. And the tensions or the dilemmas that we face are the moments where they sort of pop up into our lives. So the invitation that I would make is to the people listening, think about something that you're struggling with at the moment. Think about a conflicting issue and it could be anything from your parenting. How do you parent in a way that you both discipline your kids but give them a whole lot of autonomy? Yeah. It could be partnering. How do you work with your partner in a way that you both are independent and yet you're working together collaboratively in a more collaborative way? It could be in work, right? How do you deal with hybridity of work, both at home and at work? So there's lots of these competing ideas. And in fact, maybe I'll just take a step back and tell you that, the way that I got into this was really because I was trying to figure out all kinds of career decisions. And I ended up doing all kinds of either oring in my own career decisions. So I was trying to make a decision. Do I immediately take a job as a consultant right out of undergrad, or do I give up that job, put it on hold, give it up, and go live overseas for 2 years? Do I, when I came back and I went into consulting, do I become an academic who studies ideas, or do I become, in the language of academics, a practitioner, a leader, someone who implements ideas, right? Those are like a lot of ors. And again, I think that what we suggest is that if you step back, if you start with those dilemmas and then say, okay, what's underlying that, right? So in the question of do I think about, going overseas, or do I stay, do I jump right into consulting? Well, there's like a real sense of, do I focus on career and what I'm going to accomplish, or do I kind of live life, right? Yeah. That's an ongoing tension people are always feeling. And as an academic or a practitioner, like, do I think about ideas or do I implement ideas? Well, that's an ongoing tension. That's the paradox, because if you look at the idea of thinking about ideas versus practicing ideas, it feels like those are in conflict, because which one am I spending my time on? Where am I allocating my resources? But actually, those reinforce one another. The more that I think about ideas, the more effectively I can implement it. The more that I implement ideas, the more effectively then I raise new questions and new curiosities to think about it. And that's where you see that interdependent relationship.
Okay. So the paradoxes are always there, and kind of the tensions are the things that bring them to light, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay. So when you experience those tensions, then those paradoxes kind of manifest themselves.
Then the question is, what's the paradox that's lying underneath it?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
And so in your book, you talk about 4 types of paradoxes: performing, learning, organizing, and belonging. So I thought maybe we could just spend a couple of minutes on each one of those to explain, like, what is that particular paradox? Like, how do you identify it and spot it? And if you have any examples of what that actually looks like in a typical person's life.
Yeah, totally. And, I wanted to say something important about this, which is that we partially point out these different paradoxes to show just how universal these experiences are. They range across our lives. Whether you label your paradox specifically in the right bucket seems less important. And in fact, if we get really more complex, these paradoxes reinforce one another. So here's a couple of examples. So performing paradoxes are the tensions that emerge because we have these competing outcome demands, these competing pressures for our outcomes and pressures for our metrics. So
Okay.
in our own lives, performing paradoxes might look like, do I focus on, again, my career and outcomes for professional demands, or do I focus on being a great mom and a great wife and, great family person,
I
right?
get
Those
that all the
kinds of
time. I'm
Right,
working on a
right. I mean,
new
these
book.
these show up for us in all kinds of ways. And by the way, the pandemic just exacerbated all of these. We can
Yeah.
talk about, the ways in which the pandemic asked us questions about outcomes of, are we focused on our economic health as a country or our social health? Well, both. Right, right. It's sorry, not our social health, our economic health or our physical health. Well,
Yep.
well, both, and they reinforce each other.
Hmm.
So these are the performing paradoxes.
Okay. And these are probably, I think a lot of people can relate to this, right? And you touched on some very common ones. And as I was saying, I'm in the middle of one of these too, because I'm working on a new book that's going to come out towards the second half of next year. And it's kind of like, well, I have time in the evening. Should I spend time writing, or should I spend time hanging out with my kids? Should I use my Saturday to write, or should I use my Saturday to take my kids to the beach? And it's like, you have this deadline, and like, how do you balance that? And it's not easy. And I'm assuming anybody with a job or anybody that has to balance like these two things of work and home, work, and like everyone can relate to that one.
Well, first of all, congratulations on working on the book. So I'm
Oh, thank
excited
you.
for you for that. I can't wait for that. Exactly. I just want to say exactly. And I think that, so just to take a step back, what do we mean by paradox? We mean that it's these dualities that come in conflict with each other, are contradictory, but they're also interdependent.
Yeah.
And they don't go away, they persist over time. So if I think about the example that you just gave, right, there's these ongoing tensions of how we spend our time because our time feels like a scarce resource.
Yep.
So am I spending my time here and having this conversation right now, or am I helping my kids do their homework? Exactly your point. Am I working on the book and putting another hour there, or am I working on, focusing on my kids? And yet, over time, what we know is that even though they feel like they are in this short-term conflict with one another, we know that they reinforce each other. That over time, the more that you feel good about the work that you're doing on the book and that you're energized by it and energized by the idea, the more energy you have for your kids, the more that you feel like you're doing a good job as a parent, the more energy you have to put toward the book. So there's this reinforcing piece to it too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that paradox, I think everybody can wrap their minds around. What about the learning paradoxes?
Yeah, and we can probably use your book to point to how each of the paradoxes
Okay.
reflect that. Learning paradoxes are these tensions between the short term and the long term, or in what we do for today and what we do for tomorrow. And these show up, in our personal lives. And so your book is a great example. Underneath that tension is the short term and the long term, how we perform for right now and how we think about investing in the future. These also show up really profoundly for organizations. So in organizations, as they're navigating change and innovation, how do they think about continuing to do what they've always done today and at the same time changing for tomorrow.
Mm.
And this is actually how I got started researching this. I was studying IBM and how their top management teams were navigating innovation and change, and how they dealt with this tension of trying to continue managing $2 million businesses and at the same time, this is back in the early 2000s, innovate to get into the technological world that we now know as cloud-based computing. So how did they deal with both of those? And in consulting speak, we talk about it as managing the core and the explore businesses. But in our own lives, it's the same thing: managing what we do well today and thinking about how we effectively learn and change for tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's a very common one, right? How do we focus on the future and transformation, but at the same time, how do we make sure that we're still getting business today and that we're operating, but at the same time planning for the future? Or focusing on the micro, but at the same time focusing on the macro. Or it's a very, very common one. Okay.
Yeah. And again, I want to just point out, to get our minds around this, these things come in conflict because they conflict for our time, they conflict in companies for resources and allocating people, and they also reinforce each other, right? The more effective that you are today, the more resources you have to build for the future and innovate for the future. The more that you do in terms of the future, the more energy you have to continue to do what you do today. So it's this reinforcing cycle.
Okay, next paradox we have is organizing paradoxes.
Yeah. So these are all the paradoxes of how we get things done. And it's everything from, do I work collaboratively with other people, or do I compete with them at the end of, or organizations? I'm doing a study now in the Canadian oil sands. How do they think about, so it's a really profound study about how they have thought about being a really dirty oil industry, really environmentally challenging industry. Can they implement new environmental technology, new environmental innovation? Well, in order to do that, they have to collaborate across a really highly competitive commodity industry. Yeah. How do they think about bringing these huge companies together that are highly competitive to collaborate with one another? So that tension between collaborating and competing in our personal lives, this might show up as the tension of giving and taking. Do I give more to others, or do I take more? Kind of has that collaboration competition feel to it.
Can it also be?
It might also be, by the way, here's another one that I think comes up a lot. Do I plan, and I think this might align with some of the things you do, right? Do I plan for the future in a way that is more planful, strategic, thoughtful? Plan, or do I let things be emergent and shifting and changing and agile over time? So how do I deal with this tension between planning out and having a strategic thought about where I'm going to go in the future? And again, this could be our own personal experiences of it or organizational. Or do I think about being spontaneous? And that's also sort of something that builds up in our how we organize.
Yeah. Can it also be about competing projects? So I have two different projects I could be working on, and they're both competing for my time and attention, and I gotta pick one.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last one is an interesting one. So it seems like a lot of the other paradoxes are, I guess you could say there's more work component involved, but the last paradox feels very, I don't know, more human of a paradox in some way. The belonging paradox.
Yeah. This one I think is the one that keeps us stuck most often, and yet it's the one that's most slippery for us to think about. So, and the way I often think about it is, and again, we'll bring it back to work life. I remember when my kids were born and a bunch of my friends were having kids at the same time, and we were really having this conversation about career versus, parenting and where we spend our time. But at the core of that, there was a lot of discourse that we weren't saying about our own identities. Like, who am I? And am I the kind of person that is going to be a family person who's really going to be there for my kids? Or am I the kind of person who's going to be career oriented and achieve in my career? And that identity really kept people stuck in making an either or decision. Oftentimes we get stuck in this either or because that's who we think of ourselves as, and we don't let ourselves grow and develop, and or we don't let ourselves be multiple things and be a bit inconsistent about those. And by the way, like, that might show up these days. I mean, this is kind of, this may be challenging, but I think one of the ways that we see paradoxes show up is in the conflicts that we're seeing at a national level around political polarization and the tensions that we see between the left and the right, more conservative and more liberal.
Yeah.
And oftentimes this identity paradox gets in the way because it prevents us from going beyond the identity politics and doing a deeper dive into what's the real issues here and how can I see the different ways that people are thinking about things.
So the belonging paradox is kind of the, well, I guess it's exactly what it sounds like. Feeling, I don't know, fulfillment, feeling connection, feeling a part of something bigger than yourself.
I think it's that, but also being restricted by it, feeling like you
Okay.
have to be consistent around that, right? So the identity paradox is, look, there's these competing ideas of who I am or what groups I'm part of, and sometimes those groups conflict, and I feel like I need to be consistent around it. I feel like
Okay.
I need to have a sense of being who I am consistently. So if I'm going to affiliate with liberal politics, I feel like I have to be consistent in all the ways that I do that. Or if I'm going to affiliate with conservative politics, I have to be more consistent in all the ways that I do that. In part because, well, I'll just say it differently. The belonging paradox is that I belong to different groups and it feels like they conflict. The
Okay.
problem there is that I feel like I need to be consistent in the way that I identify because psychology will say we like other people being consistent. We like consistency, right? And so that's why it becomes a problem.
Workplace is a business communication tool from Meta. Think Facebook, but for your company. It's part of Meta's vision for the future of work. A future in which we'll all feel more present, connected, and productive. Start your journey into the future of work at workplace.com/future. Again, that's workplace.com/future. Why is either or thinking a problem? Like, why is that bad? I mean, if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking like, okay, paradox is like, I'm confused. Like, I'm good with my either or thinking. Why do I need to change that?
Right. And there are lots of people who are saying I'm good with my either or thinking. And I want to go back and maybe just tweak something that you said earlier. We are not at all advocating for throwing out either or thinking. What we're suggesting is that it's valuable in the short term. And actually, it's kind of valuable to get you to the both and. But the language we say, that what we say is, look, this kind of thinking is limited at best and detrimental at worst. Okay, so limited at best is that what it gets us into is some ruts, and I can sort of talk through these vicious cycles. But limited at best is that both and thinking offers up more creative possibilities. And so detrimental is that we say, look, like there's these different patterns that either or thinking leads us down that become these detrimental. We talk about them as vicious cycles because we just keep cycling downward. And there's three of them, and I'll just talk about them briefly to say why this is so problematic. The first vicious cycle is that we just get stuck in one point of view, and we talk about it as intensification because we get stuck, we continue to do the things that we've always done, we intensify what we've always done, and then when the world changes around us, we're stuck and we're like, we can't get out of it. And so we talk about that as like falling down a rabbit hole. And so that might be, the fact that some people might get stuck in the job that they're currently in because they're not willing to learn something new simultaneously. They're performing really well. They don't want to pause. They don't want to stop what they're doing. And yet what we know is that performance is eventually going to be no longer valuable to the company. So how do they shift to learn, right? So that's the problem with this kind of intensification or rabbit hole. Then what might happen is that if you are stuck in your current job, you're performing really well, you're not willing to learn something new, to grow, to change, to try something new and live in this sort of today, tomorrow tension. The world changes around you, and the next thing you know, you have to change, and you have to change quickly. And sometimes often what happens, is that as a result of that need to change, you almost swing to the opposite side, the alternative approach, right? And so we talk about this as overcorrecting, right? You go from one side and you go straight to the opposite side. And the image we use is a wrecking ball because essentially you kill all the good with the bad, right? So an example that we use that sometimes resonates with people is when dieters sort of are navigating dieting, they might understand this kind of yo-yoing when you're incredibly disciplined and you're really focused and you can really discipline until you lose it. And then you just sort of give it all up, right? And you swing completely to the other side where like you've let everything goes. And then you're like, no, I got to get disciplined again. As opposed to dieting, when you're going to diet along the way, you're going to have some discipline. But you know what? Every once in a while, you need a chocolate chip cookie or whatever else the possibility might
Nothing
be.
wrong with a cookie.
So, nothing wrong with the cookies, right? So I think there's that sense of like swinging back and forth. And then I'll just say one more thing, because I think this is actually the most pernicious, which is, when we get stuck in our ruts and in our own identities and in our own focus, one of the problems is that there's other people who have a different point of view and we get into conflict. And this is where we get into the right, wrong, either or kind of thinking. And we talk about this as polarization. Like we see this at a national level as polarization, but we also see this in our own families, right?
Yeah.
I take one stance and so somebody else is going to take another stance with the right versus wrong, right? Or I have twins. I mean, I saw a lot of like, I'm right, you're wrong. And if I'm right, you can't also be right. You must be wrong. And we talk about that kind of conflict as trench warfare. And the reason we use that image is because if you imagine like people digging a trench where they're digging deeper and deeper into their own positions and they're, shooting out at the other side without really knowing what the other side has to offer. And those are the cases where these different poles of paradox reside in different groups, and the groups or individuals or different individuals, and they're not willing to work together to surface their differences, to point to the kind of competing ideas, competing identities they have, and be able to sort of understand those and use those to get to a better solution.
Okay.
So that's why we see these things really can lead us down some detrimental paths.
So it sounds like what you're saying is instead of saying, okay, pick the left or the right, you can pick both. And so for a lot of people, it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, I can't. Like I have to pick a project. I have to pick either project A or project B. I can't do both. It's too much work.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm assuming a lot of people listening and watching this might be saying, well, that sounds too good to be true. Like, how do you,
Right.
how do you go about doing that? So I guess the first thing before we jump into that is it important for you, like as an individual, are you supposed to identify the paradox that you are being faced with? Like, do you take a step back and say, okay, which paradox is this? What are the tensions that I'm being faced with? Are you supposed to think through that?
I mean, I think there's a way of getting, I think that's paradox, like the second level of paradox. I think there's a way of getting into this thinking that's a little bit easier.
Okay.
Right. So in some ways, the easier way to get into this thinking is that when someone offers you an either or, you change the question. And here's what so we like to make this analogy to meditating, right? The meditating has this long-term goal, this long-term possibility. You're always practicing it. It's not easy. So this is the same with navigating both or navigating paradox. It's not easy. It's emotional. You're always engaging with it. But when you're meditating, the first step into meditating is just notice your breath.
Yeah.
Right. So for the folks that are saying, gosh, I don't get it, and like this is really hard, the first step really is to, before you're starting to notice all your paradoxes and be able to identify them and then type them, and it's just to change the question, right? So if the question, if we go back to your question, should I work on my book or should I, be there with my kids? As soon as you hear this or question, then the question can become, how can I work on my book and engage with my kids? Now, that opens up all kinds of new possibilities of how you start thinking about it. Now, at any particular moment, you're probably not working on your book and engaging with your kids at the exact same moment. But the change of the question starts opening new possibilities. How can we as a society think about, in the pandemic, economic health and physical health? How can we embed some of our both more liberal ideas and more conservative ideas? What does it look like? How can we think about performing incredibly well in what I'm doing today and think about what it means to try new things and learn for tomorrow? And so that's the first stop, because it sort of shifts our mindset to say, okay, there's something going on here. What's possible?
It seems like the basic step is just kind of reframing the question. When you
Yes.
when so I guess when the paradox first comes up, you just try to reframe the paradox in a way that doesn't make it in a way where you have to pick between one or the other, and instead it helps you find a solution for why you can have both.
Right, exactly. And it's funny. I work with as you said, I have this team, this women's leadership team, and increasingly now, as we start navigating questions, my colleagues say, "Oh, right, Wendy, this is a both and. This doesn't have to be an either or." And my kids do that too, by the way, but they do it and they roll their eyes at the same time, right? But as soon as these either or start coming up, my colleague Marianne Lewis and I, my co-author, we have this kind of professional hazard that you ask us an either or, and it's like, well, how could it be both, right? How can you accommodate both and live in this ebb and flow of these competing ideas?
Yeah. That's interesting. I like that way of just being able to kind of reframe the question a little bit, which seems like a very easy place to start with. One of the things I think you also talk about in the book, you have, I think you called them traps, right? The cognitive, emotional, behavioral.
Yeah.
Was there another one, or were those three?
Yeah. Behavioral, cognitive,
Yeah,
emotional.
yeah,
Right.
the three traps.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what those traps are and how do they manifest. Like when you say traps, what exactly are you talking about?
Yeah. And so Jacob, I'm going to go back to your other question for just a second and put this on pause because I don't want to leave people in thinking that just reframing the question is the only way to get there.
Yeah.
All right. I want to just go down for 1 second to say that actually once you reframe the question, the next part of the question or the next part of thinking about these paradoxical tensions, then the next step is to do what we call separating and connecting. And so here's what that means. Separating means pulling apart the opposing ideas to understand each one and doing a deeper dive to really get into what each one is about in order to find synergies, connections, and linkages, right? So what we mean by that is to say, look, like you're not going to at any moment be writing your book and being with your kids. I'm not going to at any moment be, I have to pick a career between being an academic or being a leader, practitioner, manager, out there in the real world. But the issue is, can I do a deeper dive, for example, in my own career decision to say, what is it that I love about academia? What is it that I love about being a scholar? What is it that I love about being a practitioner, leader? What's great about that? And what are the ways that I can engage in both of those pieces over time so that they reinforce each other and do better? So, just to be clear, if people are walking away thinking, okay, that's all nice and good, but at any moment I have to make a decision. Yes. Like I had to make a decision. Was I going to go back to grad school and get a PhD or not? So yes, you have, are you going to spend that hour writing or not? Yes. And over time, over the long term, how can you think about accommodating both? Well, the way is to start by breaking them down and separating them from one another. So I wanted to just pause there and just say that. Maybe we can go down that road or we can go back to traps if you want.
Yeah, let's talk about the traps for a few minutes. And then right after we go through the traps, I think we can spend the next 15, 20 minutes really diving into the action items and the steps that people can take. But I love traps. I'm a big fan of traps. I play a lot of chess and traps are a big part of that. So I'm really curious about the traps when it comes to these paradoxes and tensions.
I love that. Yeah, so this goes back to the conversation that we were having about vicious cycles and why either or thinking gets us stuck. And so what we did was we said, look, like there's a whole lot of psychology and research that points to why it is that we end up getting really stuck in one pattern, one way of thinking, one way of engaging. And part of that is the way that we think. Right, is our cognition. And the way that we think is that we like to have things that are consistent. As we were saying, there's a bunch of research that we like things that are consistent. And that the way that we think is that we tend to find, we want to be right. So there's a bit of the ego in our thinking. And that we then end up finding other people. There's this issue that we talk about, the confirmation bias. We surround ourselves by other people that legitimate how we think, right? So how we think sort of keeps us trapped in focusing on one side of an argument or one side of an issue without considering and engaging with the other side.
Yeah.
As well, right? There's emotional traps. We get really egotistical and defensive if somebody tells us that we're wrong. So we just double down on why we're right about something because we want to assuage our ego. And it's kind of, so part of navigating paradox is keeping things open, being a little, it's a little, as we started out with the liar's paradox, like it's a little bit mind boggling and it feels uncomfortable. It feels uncertain. It sometimes feels really anxious to keep things open. Again, I keep going back to the pandemic, but I think the pandemic has reinforced that for us, which is that this uncertainty, what we want is certainty. So part of our emotions lead us to want to do things that are certain. And we know this to be true, once we get into habits and routines, and this is the behavioral traps, we reinforce and continue to do the things that we've always done. So, all of these things converge. They reinforce each other. They converge to keep us doing the things that we've always done on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I think one of the big traps I always fall into, I think you mentioned being right,
Yeah.
is I struggle with that one a lot.
You are not alone in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of funny because you know you're doing it, but you're kind of like,
Right.
it's almost like quicksand where you know you're doing it, but you're kind of like, I can't get out of it. Like, the other person will point it out and say, are you really just trying to be right here and win this argument, or are you like trying to find a solution? And you know everything that's going on, and you're like, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't
Jacob,
think.
I'll give you an example. When I do workshops for organizations, what I will often do is I will have them arm wrestle.
Oh my God.
So I don't know if you've ever, and this is not mine. I've taken this from others that talk about conflict, but I think it's a great illustration. So I get people to arm wrestle, and I say to them, "Okay, what's the rules of arm wrestling, or what's the goal of arm wrestling?" So the goal of arm wrestling is that you want to get the other person's hand down, right? And so what people will do is that they'll pause and they'll fight against it to get the other person's hand down. And so I say to them, okay, your job is to arm wrestle for a minute. And it's not just can you get the other person's hand down, it's how many times can you get the other person's hand down. The person who gets the other person's hand down the most out of the whole group wins, right? And so people go straight into the mentality of, okay, the way to arm wrestle is that I get the other person's hand down, but I have to fight them from trying to, I get my hand down, but I have to fight them from trying to get their hand down. And they get into this defensive competitive stance. And somewhere along the line, someone will realize, oh, wait, if we collaborate as a team, we can get so much further. And then they'll stop fighting, and then they'll just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So in a minute, they can get each other's hands down like 100 times.
Yeah.
And the important idea here is to remind ourselves like how stuck we get in the rules that if I win, the only way for me to win is for you to lose. The only way for me to be right is for you to be wrong.
Yeah.
And we all fall right into that. And it's really important it's valuable, I would say, to remind ourselves just how poignant that is and how important it is or valuable it is to move from that.
Yeah. How do you spot these things? Because it seems like if you're not aware of the tensions, of the paradox, of the traps, you're not going to take a step back and realize that you should be doing anything as a result. So before we talk about the solutions, let's talk about how do you spot these things and then know that you should be coming up with a solution? Are there some signs to pay attention to?
Well, Jacob, this is why everybody should buy our book.
Yes.
I mean, again, I think that there are some ways, I think that when we start to, so a couple of things would come to mind. Again, the first is that when we hear this language of either or we see people getting into conflicts with one another in which they're not listening or engaging with one another, there's not a lot of both anding going on there. When we see two sides of an argument, there's not a lot of both anding going on there, right? So, and sometimes it's that you are getting into this conversation. Certainly my husband and I do this all the time. Both of us are quite stubborn. We both like to be right. And oftentimes we'll have to say to each other, okay, we're both trying to be right here, but we have to pause the conversation and come back to it later because we're so emotionally invested in being right. We can't even move to the point of listening to the other person. I think it's one of these situations where if you're talking so much more than you're listening, you're really trying to defend yourself and not being curious about what the other person has to say.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's kind of one telltale sign. What if it's just you? Are you, is there something that you should be just looking out for yourself?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. I had a colleague who was really stuck in a career decision for years and years and years, not sure what they were going to do,
Yeah.
constantly like those kinds of sense of like stuck where you are over time really sort of might say maybe there is something here that you're not looking at an alternative perspective and being open to it. Now, I want to be clear here. This is not easy. This is not for the faint of heart, right? Like it's easy to get into meditating and start there, but it's hard to get to nirvana. It's easy to kind of start by reframing the question. This is hard because it's emotional
Yeah.
and it's not easy to do. And one of the interesting things that we've found in, again, some of the workshops that we've done is that we've asked people to think about their tensions. We've walked them through a process for both anding their tensions, and then both anding tensions, but dealing with somebody else's tension. And then we asked them to go back to their own tension and find their own both and we were
Mm.
finding that people were so engaged in thinking about the both and in a more generic situation, but they were finding it really hard to think about the both and in their own experience. And so what
Interesting.
we started to do was we started to say, okay, you know, instead of thinking about your own both and, get into pairs, share your attention with someone else and ask them to come up with the both and for you.
Oh,
And I think there's some wisdom in, it's hard to do this in our own lives, again,
yeah.
because we're stuck, cognitively we're stuck, behaviorally we're stuck in a particular identity. It's hard to sort of see beyond our own stuckness.
Yeah.
There was a leader that we've worked with who always says, like, a fish doesn't really know it's in water.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, when we're sort of swimming in our own commitments to a particular point of view, it's kind of hard to realize that we're doing that unless somebody else helps us. And by the way, it's hard for somebody else to help us unless we're willing to ask them for help. So you're kind of in a tension right there. You're in a paradox
Yeah.
right there. And yet, that's what it means to sort of stay curious and stay open to other people's perspectives.
Thanks for tuning into this discussion with Wendy. If you subscribe to the show, you will also get a bonus episode where Wendy shares some tools you can use to navigate paradoxes. You will learn about the 4 zones of navigating paradoxes, and Wendy will also share the role that leaders play when it comes to navigating paradoxes. It's just $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, and as a subscriber, you will get early access to new episodes, ad-free listening, and bonus episodes like the one with Wendy. It's less than the cost of a cup of coffee a month. A subscription is like getting coaching and mentoring from some of the world's top minds to help you succeed at work. Where else will you be able to get access to these types of leaders?